My name is Sue Reed. It's really Evelyn Sue Kimbler Reed. That was my name that my parents gave me. Naturally, Jim changed it in 1961 when we were married. So this makes our 62nd year together, I guess. And we're still going. So, I've lived in the community since 1962. However, it wasn't the first time that I was introduced to Pacific. The first time that I came to Pacific was probably when I was 5 years old, and my father brought me through this way because he thought the sand mining caves would be interesting to a little child. He was scared to death because I was known as the crippled child, because I couldn't walk because of the bone disease that I had, and he was trying to get me into the hospitals in St. Louis. So anyway, I went through. I was much impressed with the caves, and they have always been something special to me. I have worked in the community for a long time.
Yeah, tell me about that.
I was a librarian for the community for 40 years. Actually worked 3 more years besides that, just to help out, because we were moving like the 3rd library, I think, here in Pacific. And after we got that settled, here I'm losing my train of thought. So anyway, I worked for the community for 40 years and met a lot of interesting people during that time. We restarted story hours and things like that for the children. And I was very interested in children's programs and children's literature. And then of course I've always been interested in the history of Pacific. And I think that's because the people here interested me. We have 2 basic groups of people that came into the area and settled it from the late 1700s on, that particularly pertained here to Pacific. And we had the Southerners, mostly from the southern colonies that grew cotton and had the plantation. They came here after the Louisiana Purchase. And then we had the immigrants who came as glad for a refuge, glad for the opportunity, and they came here and they did very well too. To me, both groups are equally important because they've both contributed much to the area.
How many books have you written?
Let's see, there's in retrospect, I think there's about 3 that I did by myself. The first one that I helped with was a place name book, like How Did Pacific Get Its Name, which it wasn't always Pacific, as you know, it was Franklin. And that was a place name book, and that was for the East-West Gateway Coordinating Council in St. Louis. And I still have a copy left, but I doubt that there are many copies left because it wasn't, they were the publishers for it and used it for their use. And then I did, the way I had, in retrospect, that book published was that we, in 1975, in honor to get ready for the American Bicentennial, I had a friend who ended up illustrating that book. Her name was Eloise Lasagna. She was a really great commercial artist that we were fortunate to have in our community. And so we decided to write a series of articles for the newspaper to be published, for all of the public to read, to become a little bit familiar with their local history in honor of the American Bicentennial, and that's how we started out. And except for a paper that I wrote for when I was 10 years old for school, I had never written anything, and I was scared to death. I didn't know if I could write anything, much less, get it published, or much less anyone read it, But so we started out, and we planned to do the 52 articles, 1 for every week, and they were surprisingly a big hit with the community. And pretty soon everyone kind of got on board on the project, and then they started coming up with subjects that they wanted to write about. I think the first one I wrote about was what we call Sand Mountain, or the bottom part of Blackburn Park. And then it went on from there. I wrote about the first drugstores, first department store, which was Mauthe's, and early businesses, and then later ones. Covered a few disasters. And one of the things that people often ask me when we're talking about local history, well, where are the houses that have ghosts in them? And so I say, I don't really believe in ghosts. I haven't seen one. And probably if I did, I'd fake, dead away. I'm not that brave that I want to take on a ghost, of any kind, sheet or no sheet. It is one of the most frequent questions. So my answer to that is, like I said, I do not believe in ghosts or spirits. But Pacific's had enough horrible happenings. We don't have to make up anything. Because we've had people who have unfortunately burnt up in fires. We've had floods. And it's quite a few other interesting things that have taken place. Not to mention the fact that people haven't always been very kind to one another. We have quite a few grisly happenings.
Tell me about the native peoples in the area. You mentioned
Well,
the
they were
Shawnee.
the woodland Indians. They have their own history, their own very important culture, and the Osage was the most prominent of those Indians. And they were a tall people, and they could walk with a proud stride, to their gait, and they moved through the area and were very prominent. And of course, they tie into our Missouri American history. Let's go back to Pacific's first name.
Yeah.
It was first called Franklin after Benjamin Franklin. And it stayed that way. We were a very tiny community. And we were a village status. And we did have a general store. First merchant here was, let me back up a minute. The first building here that was used commercially was established by Thomas Watson. And he had like a way station. And if you can imagine our Merrimack Valley with only one little cabin in it, one little lean-to and a family. And what they had was a lantern, and they had a warm place in front of the fire for people traveling through. And they had some whiskey, and they had some fodder for the animals, and a dry place. And that was probably the most valuable service that they could give to anyone coming through. Because if you were coming through in a wagon with your poor little family that had gotten wet and tired, and to see this light at the base of what we have now, Blackburn Park, that would have been very welcoming to you. And you would have been very happy to have spent the night on the floor in front of that warm fireplace.
So that was the first
That's
building.
Thomas Watson's, and it's still standing.
What building is that?
It's now the offices for the St. Bridget's Catholic Church.
Oh yeah, that
up
building.
on 2nd Street. Mm-hmm.
Huh.
It's all covered over. You wouldn't know all the history that's just sleeping there in that one
But
little
at
corner.
least it's still standing in some form.
Yes, it's
That's
a
rare.
marvelous old building. But this log structure, there's a lot of controversy about when it was there, but my estimation is about 1831 or 1832. It was after after the Louisiana Purchase. But Franklin County is the 3rd largest county in the state of Missouri. It took a long time for us to get this crowded and uncomfortable. So before it was just, pristine, a huge Merrimack Valley with the foothills of the Ozarks coming in. It's still a very, very beautiful place, and we need to protect it.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway.
And then the railroad.
And then probably the most significant thing for change after that was the coming of the railroad. And of course we had people like Mr. Inks and others who laid out some formal portions to our town. But Pacific's not a founded town like Herman is a founded town. Pacific is a settled town. That's like where Mr. Watson came here. And then Mr. Off came here, for the first store building. And that's where the other little people came, into town. And those that actually lived here in town, like Mr. Mauthe and that, they set up their village government in this store, and they would meet probably once a month or whenever they needed. Because after all, they say, hey, let's have a meeting, and they would have it. And usually it went pretty peacefully. However, some of their early meetings, if you look in the city documents, are over the need for a jail, and they called it a hooskow. And said, we really need a hooskow here for the rough people that come through that kind of celebrate a little too much, and we need to cool them off. So they did finally get their little stone jail built. And right after that, they did build their first school, which showed that there might be some progress, in saving of the valley after all. And the first school building was up on 4th Street where Clarkson Eye Care is. And that building was constructed about 1855, and it was torn down after the library left it. Not right away. It was used for a few other community needs and things, but it fell into the hands of the school board, and before they tore it down, and they decided that they had enough responsibility, and they sold it, which was their right. But I hated to see the old building go. Any old building.
Yeah, it's hard.
Well, not any. I mean, I realize that we have to be what they call progressive about it. But at the same time, we seem to harvest a few of our buildings that we shouldn't. Well, the railroad came in 1853, and it didn't make a profound change to the area. We didn't even have a depot. We had kind of we didn't even really have the first shack that served as the depot. But the first train that came out from Kirkwood, see, they came and they built that first 37 miles from Kirkwood out. Captain Kirkwood was in charge of that. And when they brought the first train, it was a little engine with the car behind it that had the fuel, the wood and the coal. And then they had like 3 flat cars, and that's what the people rode out. And it moved so slow that you could actually walk if you were a strong individual beside the train. But it was, it was safe and as things could be in those days. And I should qualify that, I guess. But they came out on the train, and boy, did it cause a lot of excitement that day. They came out and they got off the train. They had brought their picnic baskets, and they had a grand old picnic. And they looked at the area, and several of them were really enamored with the area because the engineer, Mr. Smith, Benjamin Smith was his name, he was so enamored of the area that he bought a double lot, and that house is still standing that was built for him. And that's up on the corner of 1st Street, the catty corner from the area that you're talking about. Not the first one, that's Mauthe's, but it's the brick house. And I think Mr. Sater owns it now, Harold Sater. So, but the train coming was fantastic.
And then that caused the name change.
And that caused the name change. But they didn't really officially change it till 1859, and it had to go through the process of the legislature to get incorporated and to become a city, and the papers all had to be filed and approved and that sort of thing. And so they became not Franklin but Pacific in honor of the Missouri Pacific.
And so that's one of the things I'm currently looking into with the railroads. I have sources that say it was originally just the Pacific Railroad that came first, and that was but it was in 1871 that the Missouri Pacific bought them out. So
that's probably true. It's just a different way of saying
it.
I think that the railroad coming through didn't really experience any really big change until the Civil War came through. It became important. They brought out products, and things. We were always lucky being on the rail line because you could get fresh oysters when the trains were up and running, because the steamboats would bring them up, from New Orleans. The coming of the railroad was very important, and probably only overshadowed by when it left in the 20s from the Great Railroad Strike and that sort of thing. But the Civil War did have damages and effects to the railroads. It damaged probably over $500,000 worth of just bridges alone. And then these were wooden bridges and had to be replaced. So the railroads contracted with Captain Peck, P-E-C-K, and Captain Peck moved out here and bought a farm. He was connected with the Army Corps of Engineers, the first one that was formed. And they formed a bridge and building works and set up a kind of an outdoor factory for collecting the railroad ties and getting the wood needed for bridges and getting the funding and Captain Peck was in charge of all that. And then later he became a mayor too of Pacific, I believe. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Then when we finally built, the first depot was a little wooden shack like. And then in 1882, they built a nice depot that was shared by both tracks, the Missouri Pacific and the Frisco. And that was really quite a nice building. They had the Palladian round windows in it. And I do have kind of a story about those windows. The railroad came about 3 o'clock at night with their representatives and their bulldozer to tear that down because it had become, they were afraid. It hadn't become a liability. They were afraid it was going to be. So they came and they were running a bulldozer over it. I was at University of Missouri attending a workshop for the library. And it was about somewhere between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, or maybe even earlier. My husband rang the phone and I was asleep, and he said, "Honey, they're here and they have a bulldozer and they're bulldozing down the depot. What should I do?" Well, I've kept him for 62 years, and I didn't say go out and throw your body in front of the machine, so to stop it. But I said, see what's going on. And so he did, and he said, I can also tell you, at the same time when he was telling me this. He said they've run down through the building and they've already run the bulldozer over the most beautiful of the windows, which was a larger one. But he said there are at least 8 others that are there that they're getting ready to run the bulldozer over. What do you want me to do? And I said, well, why don't you just see if you can buy them? So we bought them. And my husband, we got them home. I was still at the University of Missouri, but Jim hauled them home in his truck. And then later on, when we were adding to our house, we added a dining room, and we put the depot windows in our dining room. So we have 6 original depot windows in our dining room, and then we kept the other 2 for the new living room that we added on to our house. And so we have that. Mm-hmm.
You're able to save something.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I guess maybe we were just pack rats, but when we were young, we didn't have a whole lot of money, and here was this beautiful architectural salvage going to waste because it was already down, and the bulldozer was headed for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what
might as well.
Might as well. So at least we saved it. They're still standing today.
So with the railroad coming in, that kind of the town then began to develop and flourish around that. You have the main street, all that. What were, you say the first department store was the Mauthe department store. What were some of the early businesses?
Well, William Noble's building was very early. In fact, William Noble and Mauthe and Off's building, which later was sold to Theo Seifert, and then later to Thomas Bacon. Thomas Bacon, I think, was an early either selectman or mayor. And those 3 businesses kind of ruled for, a while. And I don't know the exact years that they were there, but we have them in our records, and you can look them up, and tax rolls if you wanted to, that work. But they were the combination of department and general stores, and the men were important that ran them, and naturally they were elected selectmen, and they ruled. So those were major ones too there. Of course, the other things that are essential for a frontier town, I'm sure we had a livery. Later feed store and liveries were run by Bill Ryan, which is where Sansoni has his working offices today. That corner there was a little red barn there for many, many years. Wow. Mm-hmm. So we had a variety of businesses. We had shoemakers, and we had people who starting off, we didn't have any banks, and I always thought that was interesting. But we were fortunate, in fact, very fortunate to have this couple. But Henry Kessler, and he was a early immigrant to our area. He was an old world craftsman. He was a woodworker and master, world-renowned wood carver. He is written up and recognized in Charles Van Ravensway's book on the settlement of the Missouri-Mississippi Valley, with emphasis on the German people, and old Henry's in there. And Henry came to our area, and what he did, like many immigrants did, is that he brought with him a little bit of money, and he also made money through his craft, and he would send back for, his other relatives and help them get settled here in the country. And then probably the most important thing that he did is that he would take on 2 or 3 apprentices every year to teach them his craft. And the other important thing that he did, since I mentioned we didn't have any banks, is that he would loan people money at it and wouldn't gouge them, at it. And he pretty well knew the people, so he could just say, well, I think you need to, straighten up your credit a little bit before I can afford to do this, because other people, are depending on this. But they did kind of like private banking, I guess you'd say. And that worked for the community for a little bit, but I still think the most important thing that he did was to give the young men. There weren't any women apprentices. I guess that was unheard of and unwelcome in those days. But anyway, there was a Mr. Lang. Joe Ottman was an important apprentice. And probably, I can't remember Mr. Henry, that were apprentices that grew up. Joe Ottman was a very interesting one. He left his mark on the community. His father was Michael, and his mother, her maiden name was Farrashon. She was a sister-in-law to Henry Kessler. And they lived, their houses and their shop is still here in Pacific. It's up on Union Street, catty corner down from the school. And there's 2 little buildings there. I think they're cream colored, but the color may have changed, because they'll sneak in and do that to you. But I want to tell you a little bit about Joe Ottman, or Joseph Ottman. He's a very interesting character. His parents were Michael, and like I said, she was a Farrashon, and she married him. And they had only Michael, I think, because his father's name was Michael. And their farm was right behind us here at this building. There was a farm there before the mining. And Michael was there. He came there in the 1800s, about the time right before the Civil War. And they came up the river, and they stopped they got off the boat at Memphis, and they were going to stay in Memphis. But they were disturbed by the slave issue. They ran into slaves on the blocks there, and it disturbed their principles. So they decided to come up here to the Missouri Territory, and then they homesteaded this little area out here. Now, unfortunately, in the middle of all that, Michael was fatally injured, or he died as a result of being dragged by oxen while they were clearing the land. And the story goes that he was able to get his crop in, but he became so handicapped from that injury that they held him up to the windows to see the wheat turning yellow and golden, and then a few weeks later, he died. And so he didn't really live to see it harvested, just that it was going to be a good crop. Now his son Joseph, Joe Ottman, he was quite a guy. He grew up. He married Emma Tebus, who was the pretty daughter of the local wealthy Tebus family, and they had like the funeral home and different things like this. And of course, they were basically supported by the railroad, which the John Tebus originally had his job with there. Now Joseph, like I said, when he finished with his apprenticeship with Henry Kessler, why he actually went to mortician school in St. Louis, learned to be a mortician, came out, and see, Henry Kessler is reputed to be our first undertaker. Our second then was Joe Ottman, and his building is still standing. It's right across from where the new post office is going to be, in the old bank building. It's the building that Edward Jones is in today.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now those two little German row houses.
Yeah.
One was the Ottman house and the other was, um, the Meat family, the Raymer family.
And did he work out of his home?
Yes, Joe had his shop set up in there. And like I said, he also was one of the principals in the railroad shop. So he had a lot of influence in the community. Joseph Ottman, like I said, was married to Emma Tevis. And they had 3 children. They had, no, I'm sorry, they had 2 children. They had Nellie, who was the eldest, and she was a lady, of course, and quite a lady. And then they had Harry, who was he lived to be only about 21 through there. He was always a frail child. But Joe, he didn't like the undertaking business. It was sad. He was a kind of a jolly person, and it just didn't gel with him. So he took the opportunity of selling that to his brother-in-law, and then he set up his own shop. He added the building onto the row house, and that was where he had a fully automatic shop for its day, wonderful tools, and just about anything that a carpenter would want. Now Joe, he set up the fire department here in 1914, and he was the first captain for our fire department, for our volunteer fire department. And the other thing that Joe did was neat, was that he was a member, really through his wife's insistence, of the Presbyterian Church. And the Old Stone Presbyterian Church has quite a history, by itself. So do several of our other churches. And they should be discussed later because they deserve their own story. But Joe, one thing that he did for the Presbyterian Church that's neat, and I hope that it lives on, it's still there, are the pews for the church. He carved the pews for the Presbyterian Church. And there are at least 24 of them that are still surviving. I haven't counted them recently, but once in a while I do, because they talk about, modernization every once in a while. It scares the heck out of me. And no, but you don't touch the pews because they are wonderful. They're solid oak and they are beautiful. And that church, the stonework interests me because we have at least 6 different styles of stone masonry around Pacific. You take the time to look at them. And we have the Irish stonemasons and the German stonemasons. And if you know what to look for, you can tell the difference in their crafts. And both their crafts are beautiful and important. Joe was really neat. And besides the fire department, the other thing that Joe did was he played in the town band. I think he played the trombone. There are some pictures in my book and pictures that we have here of the town band. And they bought the first, I think they had a horse-drawn fire equipment at first. And they had a white team that pulled it. That the team actually belonged to Mr. Schuhart, who ran the ice plant. And whenever the fire dong bell would go off, which was located down across from, it'd be the corner of First Street and St. Louis Street, where those horses knew what was going on, and they'd charge up ready to go, and they could hardly hold them back to get them hooked up. And then they'd, go off on their turn. I have a whole story about the ice plant that I can't tell you about because that's my husband's story. When I met my husband, he was running the ice plant.
Oh, really?
Yes. And my husband's name is James Reed.
Uh-huh.
And when I married Jim, there were no less than 6 Jim Reeds here in town. And in those days, you would drive up to the gasoline station, like Texaco or someplace, like that, and you had a little account there that you put your gas on. And as long as you paid it, every week, it was fine, it worked fine. And we used that and enjoyed it. And one day I was in the gas station, and I had my gas pumped for me, which is very nice. I missed that service. And my gas was filled up, and I said, okay, now you charge this to Jim Reed. And this big, tall, I'm only 5 foot tall, and not even that anymore. But this huge man turned around and he said, young lady, I am Jim Reed. What business do you have charging gasoline to me? And it was intimidating. I nearly fell over, And so I looked at him and said, but I am married to Jim Reed. And then Don Covington, I think, was running the gas station. And he said, oh, Jim, calm down. He said, there's at least 6 Jim Reeds here in town. And she is married to one because I know her whole family. So, but anyway.
Well, and
now my husband, see, he was very young. We were very young. When we married, he was only 22 and I was 1 month from being 20. And so Bertha Schuhart, the daughter of the man who had the ice plant built, incidentally Joe Ottman built that in 1914. It's a fully automatic refrigeration system with ammonia in it. And I don't want to get into technicalities too much because that's my husband's story. Well, talking about the ice plant. The ice plant took up a whole block, and it's a whole story in itself, and it's a wonderful story. And unfortunately, it did burn. We had the opportunity to buy it when Bertha knew that she could no longer run it. And Jim had worked there 7 years, and he had kept the ammonia system going that made the ice, processed, and then cooled the whole plant. And she knew that she couldn't keep it. We looked at it, and you could build a whole new plant cheaper than you could renovate that. And for young people, it just didn't make sense. So Lloyd Baker offered to, have Jim, do something with him. But then Jim said, no, I think I want to try something, in St. Louis and try something different. My wife and I are young, and, and we want to build our house and on the farm and that sort of thing. And so they decided Baker and Jim decided not to go into business, but Mr. Baker went on and built his huge ice plant, which is standing out there today.
When did we get a bank?
About 1890. Now, the bank has kind of an interesting story. We're talking about the old Pacific Bank. The money for that came from Joseph Ehrreiser. Now, Ehrreiser was a 49er. I mean, I'm talking about the kind of fellow that went out west with the gold rush. And he went out west, and he was a lucky one. He didn't end up in the hardware store out there. He ended up actually finding gold, and had enough that he had more than $50,000 in gold come back. And he came back to Pacific, and he invested it here. And one of the things that he did was to provide the money to open the bank. The other thing that he did was that he had a pretty daughter. And she reached her maturity, and she married into the Rao family. And now the Raos go back past the Civil War, and the Raos were German stonemasons. And a lot of the stonemason walls that the Rao brothers, and this picture of the boys in their Civil War uniforms in my book. Anyway, one of them was a stonemason, and they did those walls. And they're still standing. Some of them we have to repair every now and then. And I noticed that the one up by the Mauthe house on 1st Street has been repaired a little bit, and that's wonderful.
And so he started the bank, brought the money with the gold, and where was that located at the first bank?
It's what the modern people call the old Rexall store. And that was the brick bank building. Mr. Omer from Omer, Texas. Greg, he's the owner of the building now, and he's slowly renovating it with dreams, I think, of getting a restaurant there, and I hope he does, follow through with it. He's a very astute gentleman. I'm sure that he's going to make wonderful things with it. Mm-hmm.
And so,
but that's typical German architecture too. When you look at that old bank building, and that was part of our original business district, down through there.
And what else was in the business district?
What was in the business district? Well, there was the bank, and then there was Raymer's shoe store. There was Schneider's shoes, not snooze. Sue Schneider's. I can't even say it. Anyway, there was a shoe store there where Mr. Snyder had all of the equipment for making shoes, and repairing shoes and resoling shoes and that sort of thing. Then we go on down to Mauthe's, and there were a couple little other business in there. The one interesting business in there was Wright Studio. Now that was run by a woman, and that's what we have some of our pictures. Is that she took the pictures, you know, and they went on penny postcards, and people collected those, and I put one collection in here myself that's pretty extensive, and so it's kind of nice that she was in there. And let's see, go on down, and there was a hotel down there, and the first it was hackers, and he got himself murdered over a squabble, and I think the trial for that is recorded at the Circuit Court at Union. If you want to look up and see if you can find some things on that. It was a rather grisly affair. I mean, a fellow, they got in a dispute, and he got shot, and that was the end of it. And then from hackers, going down to Mauthe's department store. The neat thing about Mauthe's is that they came with our whole family, and the ladies were millineries. You know, they made the hats, made beautiful hats, the Easter hats for the women to wear to church, and of course, I bet that was kind of interesting because it came along with all the ladies' gossip, you know, and everything else in the fitting of it. But it was a wonderful operation, and it stayed in business, you know, quite a long time. I can't remember exactly the date right off the top of my head that went out of business, but, you know, we have plenty of records on it. Now, the other interesting thing is the Mauthe family produced one of our mayors, Louis Mauthe, and his house is torn down, but it was kind of across from Subway where the pool place is today. And so we had Mayor Mauthe. He was a good mayor. We were fortunate to have. We did a whole program on mayors. You may have seen the stuff that we collected. And we were fortunate in our mayors. Some of them, even the ones that were a little rowdy, even the ones that were ready to poke somebody in the face, and the ones that gave too much advice, were still an interesting collection, you know, of mayors that contributed a lot to us. So getting past Mauthe's, then I think there was another hotel. Over the years, I think it's been called the Pacific. It's been called the Gorn Hotel, and then I think the Sexton Sexton sisters ran it for a while, and it went out of business probably in the late '60s, early '70s, and the building's torn down now. Then we had Ignatz, that's with an I, Ziegler, and Sorella Shoes. Those two families intermarried, and Sorella was an immigrant shoemaker and salesman, and a really nice fellow. He had two beautiful daughters. But Ignatz Ziegler, he was one of our early marshals. We have a picture of him, and our pictures running around there. We joined his tavern, where he kept law and order in the tavern and the streets, and has his little badge on. And going around, we get on down then to the gross, what they called the gross industrial block, which had Excelsior beer thing. They had rooms and kind of a hotel for workers, and they had the railroad eating house was down there, which goes back to the Civil War. It's one of the surviving buildings from the Civil War. They did a lot of the devastation, but let's see. Going back, one thing I wanted to say about that whole row of buildings down there, from like the old bank building on down, not including the bank building, but the tops of those buildings were taken off, and a whole story on all of those buildings were put on to accommodate railroad workers who came, and we had a housing shortage whenever a group of them would come in and work for the railroad. So these rooms were available so that the railroad men could bring their families up, and they could rent a room, you know, while they were doing the work for the railroad. So that really changed the face of the street and the business district, because it expanded their areas, not only but that one building that's still standing where they made the movie Shiloh.
Oh, yeah.
Why, that building is still standing, and that's about 4 stories there, if you look at it. And those were all rooms that accommodated the railroad workers.
Make room where you need it, I guess.
Yes. So then we get down, the transcript was down there about where the old shoe factory was. and that's right about to the corner across from, I think that's more of the, is that the pool and spa place?
Mm-hmm.
And that was where Snyder's also had their first little grocery store, and then it became the ambulance district's building and what it is today. So, and then the street, just kind of merges down there. So, and then, so then the second bank was built in 1910, and that was the Citizens Bank. And Airiser had, through the Rao family, had money in that, and so did Mr. Gross. Oh, I forgot to mention the Gross Bakery is really important to our area, and I'll get in trouble for that because they made the best ham sandwiches that was ever made and ever will be made. But the secret to the Gross's Bakery was in their ovens, and their ovens were not wood and they were not electric; they were coke fired, and the local boys, when they're about 10 or 12 years old, were hired to go down and start the coke ovens early, about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, so they could heat up. And then by the time the baker got up, Mr. Gross, and would go down and bake. And by that time, it was the second generation of Grosses, and that would be Eugene. I'm sorry, it would be Irwin and Eugene. They were brothers. Eugene was more the business area. Eugene was the one. Irwin was the one that loved, because he always gave the poor kids 13 donuts, the baker's donuts, instead of. So, we've had interesting doctors, professional people who lived here, lawyers, different ones. The doctors, we had Dr. Power, he was a doctor, but he was really a druggist, and his building was where Reed Insurance is, kind of between there and Kaleidoscope. And it was 2-story. We have his wedding picture here, and his name was James Powell, and his father was a planter. Sent his son typically, off to be if you were a planter farmer, they followed the Southern tradition of sending your elder son off to be either to get the land and be a planter. The second one was always a doctor, and then a lawyer, and then a minister was the third profession that they could choose. And it was pretty rigid. The first post office was down there in the off store, and it was just a slot. And that took care of all the mail, And then when it went through the Theo Seifert, like I said, bought the store, and then Mr. Bacon, and then when Mr. Gross became the postmaster, why, it was down there next to the bakery, and probably out of the bakery and the Enterprise there. But it wasn't official. It was a official U.S. post office, and we do have a picture of that. So we have good pictures of the Merrimack River. I think that the fact that it should be acknowledged as a dangerous river, and it harvests. It loves to harvest the teenagers, and there are usually like 2 or 3 teenager kids every year that are in the Merrimack. And there are people though who love the river and have lived by it, and we have to remember that was our first air conditioning system too, because from Times Beach to Eureka, all the way up our rivers, where the St. Louis people, would move out and they'd have a little cabin or campground, there. And so they'd bring the family out and keep them cool in the summertime, while the poor father had to work in St. Louis until Monday through Friday. But, it was a way of surviving,
Yeah.
So, and they had terrible heat waves, and things. Not as bad as we're having now,
Yeah, but still.
Because we're shattering world records. But one of the things that I think it's exciting, and I think it's terribly important that we keep our local records. And more important, that they become accessible. Because I still get questions from people, that want questions about, well, what did this building look like, and what was this family like, and they'll say, this is my family. And it's the only record that's in existence of it, because we had a fire And all our family Bibles and things, were burned up. That's what they will, often say, and it's sad, what I mean? And they're so joyful and so grateful whenever you can give them just even a copy of what their grandmother's house, looked like. Roads are important, and they were, our way of getting around with the buggies and things. And it really, it would take you about a half a day, but you could get from here to Union, to the county seat to get your business and get home, before dark if you needed to. But that gravel for the red gravel that they paved our streets on was actually mined, and that layer of gravel, it's probably a mining term for that, the strata, I think is what it is. That strata of rock comes from, the river has filtered it out. And over behind the box factory, by the Merrimack River over there, clear up to where the present post office is, where that deposit of gravel actually runs. And then that gravel was bought by the Jeffries family, and they had a quarry, and we have pictures of the red gravel quarry with the horses and the caissons, and showing how they mined that gravel and put it on our streets. So our streets, well, they were down in the mud they started off. And then, of course, Missouri had a big program called Get Missouri Out of the Mud that was very effective at helping, to our roads. But our roads and our trails and our rivers, well, they're very important in our area for transportation, for commerce, and life in general. Mm-hmm. Well, I just would like to encourage the people to help protect, our records and our history. And what we have left, we need to protect, because it's not going to be built again. And don't forget the people, because the bottom line is that our people who have served in the past, built our community, and have worked here all their life, they're our treasures too. And we need to protect and encourage them and their families to stay here, work here, to be here, because they are part of us.